Thank you everyone for joining us for this last seminar of the fall semester, and thank you everyone for joining throughout the semester. I think we've put together a great lineup of speakers, had a lot of really great talks, and more importantly, great conversations. So thank you everyone for joining, and I hope you guys have enjoyed the speakers as much as I have. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joseph Bump. So before we get started, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, don't be shy at the end of the talk. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question face to face. But yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joseph Bump. He holds the Gordon W. Gullion Endowed Chair in Wildlife Research and Education, and is the Director of Graduate Studies for the Conservation Science Program here at University of Minnesota. He focuses on the functional role of wildlife species play, alive and dead, in the ecosystems and how that applies to biodiversity conservation. He mostly focuses on large mammals and currently leads research projects in Voyagers, Isle Royale, and Yellowstone National Parks across Minnesota and in Switzerland, Kenya, and India. His curiosity in the natural world began with a childhood spent mucking around the Hudson River, Tivoli Bays, in upstate New York. He earned most of his college tuition by catching salmon as a commercial set net fisherman on the north side of Kodiak Island, Alaska, which was a formative experience in the natural world. Undergraduate field courses at the University of Michigan's Biological Station confirmed Bump's interest in animal ecology, and he finished a biology degree in just a little over 4 years. And with that, take it away.
All right, thanks, Jack. And thanks to all of you out there that are tuned in remotely. As I arrange all my windows here, bear with me. I hope you find the next hour of your precious time well spent. Let's begin straight away with a pop quiz. Now, before I show the quiz, some instructions. First, I'm going to show you a picture of 2 animal skulls. And the one and only question on the quiz is, do you know or can you guess what 2 species are pictured? Enter your answers in the chat. Second point of instruction, anyone who is a member of my lab group is excused, is actually not permitted to answer because I've tipped some of you off to this image. So you'll be booted. I've programmed Zoom to boot you if you answer from my lab group. So please enter. Here's the image. I'll give it a minute and I'll monitor the chat. Whoops. No guesses so far. A couple of them trickling in. Got maybe a seal for the big one and some sort of mustelid, a weasel for the small one. Well, thank you for the brave souls that are participating. Let's go to Alaska to find out.
Floating, watching the orcas do their thing, and I saw this little head poke up out of the water. It's an otter. Dude, that otter is in trouble, man. Oh my gosh, he's coming right at us. Holy cow. Oh my gosh, he's coming right to the front of the boat. Oh, dude, that poor otter wants to get the heck out of the water. Oh my gosh. I yelled over to the other captain, where did the otter go? She's like, it's on the back of your boat.
Gosh. I just breathed in orca breath. Hey, I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm not gonna hurt you. You're good. You can chill up here as long as you need.
otter kept jumping in.
So the large skull was an orca skull, and the small skull was indeed a mustelid. It was from a sea otter.
Well, John has a little buddy. Orcas surrounding him.
The energy coming off that orca was so strong. It was as though I was in the water with that orca. Felt like a knot in my stomach. It's an energy I've never felt off of an orca before. As soon as it got up to the deck,
Get a cue on the outcome there.
she kind of plopped down and took a
Change
breather.
in
You could
music.
see that the otter had been completely exhausted from game of cat and mouse with the orca and just needed a break.
I gotta go and do my pickup. There's no way in heck I'm gonna try to get him off my boat right now.
Eventually, once we were a good ways away, the otter will hop off the boat and swam away to freedom. We're floating.
Okay, so the otter behavior in that video supports what's called the human shield hypothesis, which describes a situation where prey species are seeking out human structures as a shield from natural, quote unquote, natural non-human predation. Hunting of otters, it's interesting, of otters in the 18th and 19th century nearly drove otters to extinction. Alaska Native people still hunt otters, and sea otters are still poached. So historically and today, almost all otter hunting was exclusively from vessels, from boats and kayaks. Yet here's an otter seeking the safety of the boat. And how does that happen? Did she learn that? Did she learn that from her mother? Sea otters often segregate in rafts like this, same-sex rafts. And did she learn that as part of one of these groups? Is it transmitted to adjacent territories, or if she disperses? Distinct orca groups prey on different items. There are orcas that specialize on herring, on salmon, on seals and sharks, and some appear to specialize on otters as well. And such distinctive behavioral groupings are traditionally referred to as ecotypes, or help define ecotypes. And is it more accurate to describe them as cultural differences? There's an increasing evidence in the field that culture shapes what and how orcas eat. And there are major ecological implications. Only 5 orcas, a single pod half the size of the one pictured here, would have to specialize on otters to explain sea otter declines in the Aleutian Islands, and that can initiate widespread indirect effects via the well-known otter sea urchin kelp trophic cascade. So that brings us and helps us focus to today's topic, considering these questions. Carnivore cultures, what are they, and why might they matter for conservation? The first thing I want to do is adjust your expectations for this talk away from a traditional research seminar. This talk is definitely ideas and information rich and data poor. We have a little bit of data that we'll present. And it stems from a manuscript that is more of a perspectives or commentary piece that's in the works. These ideas in that article are developed primarily with Dr. Stotra Chakravarti. He's a former postdoc in the lab, and now he has a faculty position started this fall at Macalester College. And we've invited some other colleagues to join the effort. Here's a list of the co-authors so far. One point I want to say overall is I'm not arguing in this talk, or we're not arguing in the paper, that all carnivores exhibit culture per se or are capable of cultural traditions, but I don't think we're willing to concede that all behavioral differences within a species are driven by genetics or by environmental cues, and that carnivore cultures are therefore non-existent. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. What are we talking about? Non-human cultures. If I say animal cultures, I'm referring to non-human cultures, although I recognize that we are all animals. This is a text-heavy slide in the talk. So the textbook definition for animal or non-human cultures proposed by Brock, is that these cultures are consistent differences in behavior between groups or populations in a species that are a consequence of some form of social learning, not directly caused by environment or genetic differences. Culture can be defined, animal culture can be defined, or all cultures could be defined as a way of learning from others, and it's repeatedly transmitted. This is from a recent review by Andrew Whitten in Science, forming traditions that may be inherited by successive generations. So a very, very brief history of the field of animal cultures next. In the past, we thought that humans' ability to have cultures separated us from the rest of animals and living systems. And for the longest time, scientists didn't believe in non-human animal cultures, and any examples of that were hotly contested. But that opinion has shifted, and evidence of culture in animals first emerged in the 20th century with a few key observations and discoveries. Famous one in the 1920s, titmice, the innovation of titmice tearing the foil caps off milk bottles to get at the cream underneath was observed in a few sites in the UK and then diffused across the country. And that behavior, these are gregarious birds, and that technique spread, and that cultural diffusion led to experiments that identified transmission chains of that behavior, and it spreads from multiple individuals. And that's a core criteria for culture. Whoops, I'm having issues with advancing. There we go. There's the reference for that. Second, in the mid-50s, Japanese macaque monkeys began sweet potato washing behavior. So they would wash their food in the surf, and that became spread from one troop in which that behavior was fixed, and that novel foraging behavior was tracked and spread throughout kinship networks. Another key paper, third key paper you could track in the history, had to do with regional varying birdsong dialects in sparrows. And that was coupled, importantly, with experiments that confirmed the necessity of learning from existing models that other individuals modeled bird songs, and that provided early evidence of vocal cultures in animals. And these early discoveries stimulated a number of long-term studies that dealt with chimpanzees, great apes, wild chimpanzees, and orangutans, and that revealed a number of different multiple cultural traditions spanning from tool use to social and sexual organization, and that was followed up with work on cetaceans, whales, and dolphins. So since then, there's been a steady stream of examples in the past century, some based on natural recordings, others based on experiments pictured here with captive or semi-captive populations, demonstrating how learning and cultural learning is really important, and the diffusion of new traditions. So we've witnessed kind of a burgeoning, or as Andrew Whitten said, or a explosion of studies. I want to next go over just a few of the kind of examples of what cultural phenomenon across species and behavioral domains looks like. And this, because it's new to my lab group, and it might be new to some of you as well if you're not focused on behavioral ecology. So vocal and migratory traditions have been demonstrated, particularly with whales and whale song. Arbitrary and social customs, fashions. So the custom here, pictured here, of placing, that's an intentional placement of that blade of grass in or around the ear by that chimpanzee, and it catches on. Other customs with capuchins also spread very fast, behaviors that spread very fast. Tool use is an example. Vocal dialects, mentioned those already. Prey selection is an important one. This is pictured here. Neighboring communities of bonobos display really different prey preferences, even if there's areas of larger overlap between adjacent ranges, and that accounts in part for differences that might be attributed to ecological explanations for those prey selection differences. And we'll come back to prey selection with examples from Minnesota as well. Predator recognition. So now we're thinking beyond, like, whales and birds and apes, where many of the prominent examples for animal cultures are. Sticklebacks, pictured here, and minnows develop fear responses to pike by learning from conspecifics. That's been demonstrated, and they can pass that disposition, fearful disposition, if you will, on to others. Other experiments have demonstrated also for birds fear of kind of arbitrary objects and can be transmitted along a cultural chain. And insects. Insects are some of the most recent evidence is coming for culture with breeding sites for fruit flies. They will experimentally, they've been able to demonstrate that egg-laying substrates, the breeding sites for those can be culturally adopted. And foraging techniques. So clearly, the weight of the evidence, I think now people would say that animal cultures certainly are present. Animals exhibit cultures. The interesting question then is where and under what conditions do we see cultural differences in animals, and why might they matter? Why do they matter in some cases for conservation? Notice that in all these examples that I've mentioned so far, the order of carnivora doesn't figure prominently. Indeed, the evidence for animal cultures is dominated by studies of primates, birds, and cetaceans. And I think that's what got our lab group really interested in this project, or this topic to begin with. Cultures likely exist for many other species and can be important for their conservation as well. And it might be so that cultures may be important to, or especially important to the conservation of carnivores. They're highly valued carnivores, socially, economically, and among the most at risk. And notably, they're among the most challenging species for humans to coexist with. In our literature review as part of the project, we're unable to find cases where carnivore cultures were considered explicitly in conservation valuation. And why is that we're left with? Is it because there's a lack of evidence of carnivore cultures, or is it because we really haven't looked at their behaviors through this lens? So the paper we're working on tries to ask and explore these questions. By virtue of being predators, carnivores are at strong odds, right, with their prey, at mortal odds with their prey, and that may favor the evolutionary history of that predator-prey dyad may favor the development of cultures. So there's strong evidence to suggest that anti-predator behaviors are based on social learning and consequently can have a high potential to create cultural differences in the prey. And that arms race then in turn compels predators to adopt novel strategies to be successful. We searched, so given that arms race, carnivores as a group might be expected to develop some specialized expertise in their predatory strategies, and that between individual difference of strategy, expert strategies, some of that's been measured, And there's differences, say, in hunting fortunes. And are those expertise then learned, potentially transmitted, independent of genetic or environmental influence? And when we searched literature and evidence for this, we're not finding explicit cultural evidence, but there are prerequisites for cultural transmission. For example, this is one example I have here of such expertise. The hunting fortunes of individual animals and the intelligence of individual animals and specialization in different prey, like salmon pictured here for Northwest Coast wolves, might be one such example where the differences in prey selection might be transmitted independent of genetic and environmental influences. Almost all mammalian carnivores are long-lived, and they exhibit definitive parental care that leads to long-lasting relationships, usually between adults and offspring. And that parental teaching then, subsequent, might pass across generations. So the fundamental demands of this natural history provides the prerequisites for cultures to evolve in carnivores. And such culture can even occur with species that we might think of as having limited sociality. So again, we searched literature, and there is some evidence, at least for learning, and that could lead to cultural development. Young meerkats, pictured here, learn scorpion predation from adults, and they learn scorpion predation. Initially, you're given a supply of live scorpion prey, but the stingers have been removed, and later they provide unmodified prey to teach young meerkats as they mature. And this is an example where social transmission of information associated with food acquisition is evidence of cultural beginnings. Spotted hyenas along matrilineal lines will definitely cooperate to solve food puzzles and accommodate both naive individuals that haven't figured out certain puzzles, or individuals that are afraid and tentative of certain puzzles. So the capacity for that sort of social learning is demonstrated with hyenas. In their independent work, Stotra and Dr. Y.V. Jala have collected evidence that suggests cultural preferences, perhaps, or cultural behaviors in mate preferences in Asiatic lions. So what they have evidence of is that experienced older lionesses showed a preference to mate with multiple rival male coalitions. But the young first-time breeding lionesses only mated with primary coalitions. So it leads to the question, are younger lionesses learning a mating strategy or behavior that minimizes later conflict and infanticide? They've also observed in cases in Asiatic lions in the Gir forest that females with cubs, or females not in estrus, so these would be considered non-breeding or non-receptive females, they exhibit behavioral estrus, and that might entice incoming non-parental males away from cubs to safeguard against aggression and infanticide. And they use mating cues that essentially bluff males to reduce infanticide. And that's relatively rare in their population, but nonetheless, it's been observed. And those observations are capable of being learned across pride mates. So again, foundational behavioral observations that might speak to the capacity for carnivores to exhibit culture. What about wolves? Something our lab studies, not only in Minnesota, but most intensively on the Voyagers Wolf Project. So in a nutshell, detailing a rundown of the methods of this project. Every spring, we capture and GPS collar wolves in northern Minnesota. Wolves are caught with foothold traps. The collars are fixed. This occurs starting usually in April 15. Collars are fixed, and then we can follow wolves' locations. It takes a team effort. The GPS collars are set for 20-minute fixes, and that allows us to track where they are going and where they have been and how they establish their territories across this system, which includes Voyagers National Park and the study area to the south. With those 20-minute fixed locations throughout the summer, the collar provides a wealth of GPS locations, and all these collars, all these clusters here of 2 or more GPS locations in close proximity within a short amount of time are intensively searched. And when they're searched, there's criteria for determining what happened at each cluster site. And it allows the project, click on this, to figure out what wolves are doing as they move across the landscape. So what they eat, what they may be doing in terms of resting within their time activity budgets, how they may return to kill sites and scavenge. Here you're looking at the track and the determination of cluster activity, the categorization of cluster activity, I think within about 2 weeks, centralized on a den location. And we do this, the royal we do this for multiple packs each year. There are usually 10 to 14 packs in the study area. They likely constitute a population of about 40 to 60 adult wolves. Estimates are counted in late winter, so it represents a minimum account. The field effort is led by Dr. Tom Gable, who's now a postdoctoral fellow in the department, and Austin Homkis. Here's Tom, here's Austin. Who's a wildlife biologist, and a very dedicated crew and crews over multiple summers that consist of graduate students and technicians and volunteers. And as an aside, we're well aware within the field of especially carnivore ecology and fieldwork that access issues when it comes to this type of fieldwork, those who volunteer can afford to do so. And we're building towards addressing that. A project model in which the possibility of this sort of field work and this sort of field experience is more accessible. But they deserve a lot of credit. I have a cluster and kill site field guide, and the wealth of information they capture from photos to videos to beavers, all the prey items, and all the documenting of different behaviors based on field evidence is quite extensive. Thousands of hours, thousands of kill sites and hundreds of kill sites, thousands of miles, thousands of hours in the field. This is not another quiz. Pictured here is a wolf skull and a beaver skull. Tom's doctoral research centered on this relationship within this area. And in this area, in the study system, there are a lot of beaver, very high densities. Every pin in this image is an active beaver sign surveyed each fall. The area is surveyed each fall. And what I want to walk you through next is the only data slide in the talk. It's evidence, I'll argue, that wolves have different personalities when it comes to hunting beavers. And if wolves have different personalities when it comes to prey acquisition, those personalities, hypothetically or ostensibly, can lead to traditions, hunting traditions that spread across multiple individuals. And if they endure, they can create lasting traits across generations. And if all that links up, I've just described what counts as culture within the field of behavioral biology. So to illustrate differences in predator personalities, what we did was again, the royal we examined wolf kill rates of beavers. So that's beavers killed per day, and wolf ambushing rates. And that's ambushing attempts per day from wolves that are in the same social group, so within the same pack, that are the same age or age class, adults, operating under identical or similar ecological conditions. Identical would be the same year, and very similar would be across years in the same area. What we're going to look at, and doing all that reduces, to the best of our ability, confounding parameters such as prey density or environmental conditions, and it allows an assessment of the role of individual personality in shaping predatory behavior. So what we're going to look at, again, we're going to look at ambush rate and kill rate. So these are pairs of wolves from within the same pack, and that's important, and then percent differences in these rates within pairs. And here's what you find. So we find really substantial variation in pack member kill rates and ambushing rates of beaver. Some wolves have kill rates and ambushing rates that are over 200%, over 250% higher than other pack members respectively, right? So that within pack variation of wolf hunting behavior, that's what this is evidence, and it provides evidence of a personality-driven difference in wolf predation. A successful beaver hunting, a successful beaver ambushing personality requires that wolves are waiting along ponds or along beaver trails, and some individuals wait much longer than others. Based on these data, you could say, popularly speaking, that some wolves might be more patient or more persistent. And certainly that variation is evidence that you can't characterize all wolves when it comes to beaver predation as the same. If wolves have different personalities when it comes to prey acquisition, personalities can lead to those traditions and spread to multiple individuals. Just a teaser for future work, we were fortunate enough, given the prowess of the field crew, to have multiple individuals, breeding pairs, both collared. And that will enable us to examine time spent together, which that inter-individual observation is necessary sometimes to establish learning. So do wolves hunt, the wolves that hunt beavers, the wolves that are successful at hunting beavers, beget more individuals that hunt beavers, and then packs that are successful in hunting beavers? Does that kind of tradition, if you will, spread? What about fishing? So here we have a wolf that is fishing very opportunistically, but very deliberately. She's making good use of an abundant resource, running white suckers in the spring, and is definitely hunting them, caching them. Do other wolves learn how to fish? And do other pack members similarly pick up these techniques and transmit them? We could consider this predation behavior as well within the lens of carnivore cultures. And just one thing to add, it's not to say that these behaviors or carnivore cultures are new. They may have existed on the landscape for millennia, but the recording of them and our ability to document them is what's novel here. And even getting over kind of the conventional or intellectual hurdle of thinking that humans are the only species that might exhibit cultures. Shifting gears here to implications for conservation. So when we think of carnivora, they're typically valued for their ability ecologically to regulate prey populations in some instances. They're big flag bearers and for restoration and rewilding currently of ecosystems. And they're real charismatic foci for tourism and not accounting for maybe the cultural diversity of carnivores could have impacts on conservation. From an evolutionary standpoint, a behavioral ecologist would argue that adaptive behaviors, if you're not considering carnivore cultures within conservation, could indeed vanish, be lost. There's no ensuring that they would be exhibited again. So a better understanding of carnivore cultures, we argue in the manuscript, can impact a number of areas. And one of them might be human-wildlife conflict. For example, is man-eating, human-eating, I'll say man-eating, a special case of carnivore culture, or is it environmental? Our group is discussing this, but it has been observed that predation of humans often occurs in very, very localized and sometimes prolonged outbreaks. And pictured here is an individual that is famed for one of those outbreaks. This is a photo of one of the two infamous Tsavo lions. That's Colonel James Henry Patterson, who shot both of the Tsavo lions. And that pair of Tsavo lions killed and ate at least dozens of railroad construction workers. Patterson reported over 100, but that might have been embellished. And you can see these Tsavo lions if you want. He sold them to the Field Museum in 1924 in Chicago. So you can actually go see them and see their skulls. And that's how we know some of these details through later isotopic analyses. But in Tsavo, the area where these lions terrorized railroad workers, there's a documented association of lions preying on humans for decades, and potentially, based on anthropological evidence, much longer, which might represent multiple generations of lions showing similar behavior. So is that environmentally driven, or is that learned? Is man-eating something that can be learned and transmitted across multiple generations? Similarly, events are consistently reported from Sundarban in India and Bangladesh, where tigers live in mangroves and are known for their recurrent conflict with humans and killing of humans. This population of tigers thrives in this environment. It has some, it's not genetically different, but behaviorally, it's quite different from mainland or continental populations. So how can species protection acts and laws that govern how conservation proceeds, how can they proactively kind of identify potential carnivore culture populations to effectively conserve significant units or deter behaviors in certain areas? So our Endangered Species Act operates at the scale of distinct population segments. What about conservation in terms of distinct cultural segments? It's one thing we posit in the paper. Similarly, but aside from carnivores killing humans, carnivores kill things we raise to eat. So wolves kill cattle, wolves kill sheep. So comparable to man-eating, do some populations develop into cattle killers? Do some packs become sheep killer cultures? Some management, current management that's occurring right now in the present, the actions of that management reflects policies that assumes so. So they'll favor lethal removal of entire problem packs under the rationale that livestock depredation is learned and it's perpetuated across generations. Similarly, livestock avoidance, even in close proximity to livestock, might be learned and perpetuated across generations. So what conditions might favor the development or the depression of depredation habits, right? And how can that be increased or emphasized? what conditions might be applied to effective, policies that would favor that. So the kind of localized and episodic nature, our current understanding of, say, man-eating and even livestock depredations, that indicates that, and the behavior is restricted at geographic scales. And that scenario mirrors a lot of other socially learned behaviors and prey specialization and hunting strategy. And it mirrors also how tool use would. So can predatory behavior be passed on from generation to generation and develop into cultures that would have management implications? Seems at least plausible. They may also develop in ways that favor coexistence with humans. For example, here we have a picture of a leopard preying on a feral dog. And leopards in Mumbai, India, they live in and around a very densely populated area, and they've learned how to avoid, largely avoid people and prey on feral and some domestic dogs, of course. So reducing the potential for rabies transmission outbreaks. So they're providing this ecological service because you could argue culturally, they've found a way, both humans and the leopards have found a way to coexist. So policy to conserve, if you will, culturally distinct Mumbai leopards would therefore preserve an important ecosystem service and provisioning to human health. Some restoration efforts implicitly recognize the aspect of carnivore behavior in specializing on different prey. For example, in the recent documentation for restoration of wolves, Isle Royale National Park, an event pictured here, translocating of wolves from a wolf population that exhibited moose predation was an important policy consideration because moose are the only large ungulate prey on Isle Royale. So they're the only food for wolves on that. It's not that naive moose, quote unquote, naive wolves likely would not learn how to kill moose. They would get hungry enough and likely figure it out. But to ensure success, that consideration was given explicitly in the management. So carnivore translocations are occurring all the time, often to mitigate conflict, to augment existing populations, or to build new ones. That's common conservation practice and is becoming increasingly important due to carnivore population decline worldwide. And the success of those translocation programs could benefit, we'd say, from considering these cultural aspects, these behavioral aspects. So what's the take-home message? Briefly, in closing, instances of carnivore culture that are researched and documented, they can lead to unnecessarily higher accounting of carnivore conservation policies and the implications. And what might they look like? Or what are they? Prey selection is most likely where we're going to find evidence, and foraging behaviors, mating behaviors as well, as I detailed with Asiatic lions. It's not that far-fetched a consideration within conservation policies. Restoration, conflict mitigation, and translocations, and even larger scale protected area planning are areas that likely matter, where carnivore cultures might matter to conservation. So the task ahead is for those of us working in behavioral sciences to be open to the possibility of carnivore cultures and to innovate methods to identify and trace those potential cultures and develop that into an applied understanding. And I think that's especially so with large carnivores, precisely because we compete so directly and so strongly with them. All right. Thanks for your attention. Lots of acknowledgements in terms of funding and support, especially the Environmental Natural Resource Trust Fund for support for the Voyagers Wolf Project. I left plenty of time for discussion, and I really welcome discussion given that these ideas are pretty fresh amongst my collaborators and within the lab. Critiques, ideas, considerations, don't hold back.
Great. Well, thank you, Joseph. I guess it looks like Tom has one comment there in the chat, but we'll open it up to any brave souls that might want to first unmute themselves and ask a question directly, or maybe have a comment or critique.
I'm reading Tom's question here. Tom's getting me back, I think, for oral comprehensive exams or something like that. This is a big question. Some comments on it. I don't think I can answer it completely, Tom, but it's a really good question. I think certainly, given what's been demonstrated through diffusion experiments, both diffusion studies, both experimental and in the field, the transmission of behavior, it can be trendy, it can be culturally transmitted and become homogeneous across a population. And then something new might pop up and again, be identical between populations or between groups. That happens often, or it's been demonstrated with whale song and the foraging behaviors associated with the Japanese macaques, I think, are strong evidence that you can have identical cultures. And I think you would that transmission, you would expect that, particularly if there's any adaptive payout, adaptive relevance to the behaviors, you know, if it affects fitness or survival or mating opportunities, those sort of things. And in that case, in that way, I think it does mirror what humans do as well in transmission and adoption of cultural practices across populations.
Can I ask a question?
That sounds like Craig.
It is Craig. Enjoyed that. That's very interesting. I want to say, sort of go in broad terms here. I think of what you've got listed on this final page is kind of a helpful starting point. When you think about carnivores that might move around quite dramatically into different habitats, they're likely going to have inbuilt a need to learn new hunting strategies, how they're going to use cover, which species are going to be available in which relative abundance. So I imagine there'd be a lot of flexibility there. When it comes to mating behavior, I'm pretty doubtful about it. And I think the examples you gave are pretty non-compelling. Just because behaviors changes with age, that's just an age-specific strategy, and individuals could be maximizing their fitness according to different criteria as they get older. We see that in the wolves and their hunting behavior in Yellowstone. We see that in a lot of things. And especially if you don't, you know, if the younger generation is not copying the old, that's almost an example of the opposite of culture. So you'd expect the younger ones to be learning from the old ones, but if they're showing a very different behavior, that suggests it's just innate and inbuilt in some way. But I do think that there's a lot of importance of these concepts when it comes to conflict mitigation, because again, it's prey, it's coming into a lot of things that are changing very rapidly around the world, a greater reliance on agriculture of different sorts. And so animals are adapting to whatever is new there. So my inclination is to say there's certain evidence that we have say that animals may be driven to change by ecological environmental change. And so man-eating would be an example of that. So the man-eaters of Tsavo, for example, that was during an enormous outbreak of disease that killed off most of their natural hoof stock. And so when we compared outbreaks of man-eating in lions, they persist for much longer than tigers and leopards, probably because they did learn within their group. So once one individual has figured out you can eat people, then the others say, oh, right, that's food. So that will change, and that could be equivalent of a culture, which is going to be really important, especially with things to do with translocations, because, for example, in India, there's been some real tragedies where man-eating leopards from around Mumbai get translocated into a new area and they keep eating people in the new location. And people were not properly warned that these translocations had taken place. So
Sure.
just in a broad sense, it just seems to me that there's certain aspects that you can make a strong claim for this.
Mhm.
The examples you gave of cheetah learning to hunt from their mothers and with the meerkats and all that, that again is foraging. So that seems like an area that you might want to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, it's why we're involving you, Craig, because you're thinking through these things in a way that's appreciated and constructive. I think there is a fundamental, well, what primes maybe a novel behavior? The titmice pulling back the caps, was it environmental that drove them to do that? And I think the initiation, where you focused on what might initiate the behavior, say, of man-eating, that may very well have some environmental inputs. Its transmission beyond and its endurance may not, and I think it is fruitful to think of foraging. The controlling for age, we tried to do that with the wolves, with the mating behavior, and of course others in the audience, Stotra can probably speak more directly to this. Exploring and being able to control for the age, I think, is the frontier of where things are. Given the overall flexibility of carnivores, which we would readily acknowledge as adaptive, right? Successful carnivores are not obligate one species predators. We could say that may be very well why detection of evidence for culture, or even attention to look for it, is lacking. And I think that'll be one of the broader points of an initial commentary or perspective, to look for this sort of thing. Because it very well may well be that some of the examples I've provided don't hold strong evidence in the long term.
Yeah, and then Joe, it looks like we do have a question from Todd. I can read it out loud if you want, or it looks like you're reading it there too.
It's a great point, Todd. Yeah, we're quick to take credit for what animals do a lot of the time. I know from my experience working with wolves that there are indeed, and I alluded to this, packs that appear to live on ranches in close proximity to cattle operations and don't cause conflict. And the dream would be able to understand why in that scenario, and then to facilitate that. And your question also alludes to a comment that Dave Smith made to me, in that the reciprocal behavior of human cultures can really drive behavioral patterns in animals as well. And your point about formerly skittish wild turkeys and sandhill cranes recolonizing the Midwest, that if they're not being hunted or culled or negatively impacted by humans, might adjust. Point, good taken. Okay, so there's a couple other questions. I'll answer the bottom one because I have been thinking about that a lot. How we might apply this information. I think one thing you might recommend is being cautious about indiscriminately removing whole packs or whole groups of wolves if it hasn't been demonstrated that they are depredating individuals. I think the practice often is, where there are problems, is to remove any of the wolves in that area. but often that's done without knowledge or under the assumption that any wolf caught in that area, because of territories, but there are dispersers all over the landscape as well. Any wolf caught in an area, therefore, is guilty of depredation. I think there's potential, again, for negative deterrence as well in management plans. Oh, herbivory. There are herbivorous carnivores or carnivora that have that. That's a good question, Sam. I'll have to think about that. I hadn't thought about considering pandas through this lens.
One thing that comes to mind too from some of my stuff in Yellowstone and following around grizzly bear clusters is there's a huge individual gradient of elk calf predation, where some bears, even overlapping territories within elk calving grounds, some bears won't kill a single elk calf in the summer, and others will kill one every single day for, a month. So there's, I think, a lot of individual variation there too. And that, could be matrilineally passed down, with some bears focusing on elk calves, others more on roots, white bark, other resources.
Yeah, I mean, not when we began discussing this, our minds immediately went to prey selection and foraging, and given the variability and the nuances and specializations that appear to that we were familiar with.
Yeah, then it looks like there is one question from Aaron too on come across any evidence of dialects between different groups of social carnivores.
Yeah, so vocalizations, it's not my forte of how to analyze recordings of howling wolves or lion vocalizations, and I'm quite ignorant of the extent and diversity of carnivore vocalizations. But that would be an area, if it was your specialty, to probably at least examine. And the tools and techniques, you would benefit from what's been done in animal cultures already, because some of the most sophisticated analytical techniques have been developed for bird song, for whale song. And you could borrow from those studies as a way to inform your methods of examining carnivore vocalizations.
Well, it doesn't look like we have anything else in the chat. Any other questions that people might have before we hit noon or 1?
Well, enjoy the snow. Otherwise, I hope at the very least I've given you something to think about. It was a little different because we were caught in the middle before we had strong evidence or extensive studies of this.
Great. Well, thanks again, Joseph. Doesn't seem like there's any other questions. That was a great talk. But yeah, thanks again, everyone, for tuning in and for joining us, throughout the semester. And have a great close to this semester and holidays coming up. We'll see you back in the spring.
Thanks for all the thanks, and you're all welcome in the chat, folks. If you have thoughts, follow up.